Good evening, everybody. My name is David Williamson. I'm the Secretary of the West Cumbria Area Committee of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's talk, which is about how to be successful in developing minimum viable products. Minimum viable products is a version of a product that is just enough features to make it usable to early customers who can then provide feedback for the future product development. A common theme in organizations is a great idea is generated, but there's little investment budget put aside and no resources to deliver that great idea. A misconception associated with this situation is that since we do not have the cash to make a full product, so the company says we'll make a minimum viable product. This stems from a basic misunderstanding of what an MVP actually is, which results in the wrong strategy or indeed no strategy at all. In this talk, we will discuss how to make a successful minimum viable product. We'll set the scene, or our speaker Ram will set the scene, get rid of a few misconceptions, talk about the essentials that are required in developing an MVP, and close with what you can do after developing the MPV to take it forward. He will provide you with some tools for the attendees to use in their own time after the talk, and it's important to understand that developing MPVs is about being dynamic, changing dynamics. Every organization, big or small, must learn to adapt its working practices as if it were a startup organization and learn to be agile and more responsive to meet the market demands. Hopefully get some takeaways from tonight's talk. You'll be able to understand what an MPV strategy is. You'll understand what an MVP development process essentials are, and you'll have a toolkit to help you have a good start to it. The talk will last about 45 minutes. You'll be able to post questions on the Ask a Question tab on the platform, and I will pull those questions together and ask as many of those as I possibly can at the end of the talk to Ram. So, turning to our speaker tonight, Ram Shankar. We're delighted to welcome back Ram. This is Ram's second talk for us in a few months. He's a chartered engineer and founder of Equitas Engineering Limited. His expertise includes delivering innovation, sustainability, and product development. His clients include the European Space Agency, the Babcock Group, Samsung Heavy Industries, UKRI, and Kawasaki. Ram is a TEDx alumni, was a member of Andy Burnham's business advisory panel throughout its existence. Is associate member and mentor of the TI UK North, contributed to the Greater Manchester Local Industry Strategy, industrial advisor, board member to the Manchester Metropolitan University School of Engineering, steering committee member with 2 regional chapters, and a professional review interviewer for the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. He's also a STEM ambassador and a business mentor with a growth company. And a all-round good chap, I think. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Ram, who can take us through how to successfully develop a minimum viable product. Over to you, Ram.
David, that is very kind of you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thank you to Adrian as well for having me back again to do another talk. Good evening, everybody. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Ram Shankar, and I'm the founder of Equitas Engineering Limited. And for those of you that know me, I am Ram Shankar, founder of Equitas Engineering Limited. Right, so today's talk, as David told you, is we'll look at what minimum viable products are and how to successfully develop them. And what I have for you is today's schedule or an agenda. We'll quickly do a small introduction to my company and myself, and then it'll be all about setting the scene, what exactly is an MVP. We'll look at 3 common misconceptions. I'll give you where to begin, and then we'll talk about essential ingredients towards the MVP strategy. Then the other thing I want to talk about is 5 factors that are shaping product development as the world is changing around us. Then I'll talk to you about some benefits of developing MVPs. And then, like David mentioned, at the end, I will provide you with 3 specific toolkits that you can go and work in your own time in understanding how you can develop those. That's the toolkit. We'll do the summary and then we'll do the questions. So quickly, what David has mentioned, my company is called Equitas Engineering. We are a small company based in Manchester. We're on a mission or a purpose to basically help people excel at what they do and therefore create a better engineered world. We offer engineering solutions, product development, sustainability-led design, and innovation delivery. As you can see, we are a member of a number of these organizations. As for me, there is nothing else that I need to add from what David has said, and I also have the pleasure of letting you all know that I've also been elected Honorary Secretary of the Greater Manchester Area chapter of the IMechE earlier this year. So, when we look at the need or the reason for develop a new product, there are two situations that present an opportunity. The first one is market driven. So this is basically a customer demand where you get an inbound inquiry, then you basically have a set of specifications the customer wants you to meet, then you do the tender, and then you basically develop the necessary product and then you deliver it. This is fairly straightforward, not complex at all, and it's basically a low risk and very common in our sector, and it's well known. However, the second opportunity is interesting. It is driven by the company itself. This is the result of a company identifying a potential opportunity which is based on observing the market, observing the people, and having a good interaction with the people. And in this instance, there is actually no customer inquiry, and more importantly, there is no guarantee you're going to get a sales order, and there is no external impetus, just the visibility of a potential opportunity. In this case, there is, first of all, a need to balance this potential opportunity with the risks of venturing forth and developing products and solutions where the path ahead is unknown and uncertain. Now, balancing these is where our minimum viable product comes in. What it does is it's a safe approach, a relatively safe approach, if I may add so, with minimal risk, and that's how you develop a minimum viable product, and that's what we will talk about for the rest of the session. Now, before we start talking about what an MVP is, let's understand why you possibly want to do an MVP. The first reason you want to do is testing an idea. Ideas are what drive the world forward, and if we look at the world around us, every piece of innovation, engineering, or manufacturing is based on an idea. Now, however, not all ideas are good. All of us know that. Therefore, the first thing to do is to validate the idea. And that's the first reason why you want to develop a minimum viable product. How do you validate your idea? The next thing is, you need to test the functionality of the product. I mean, is the product actually going to do what we think it should? If it will work as intended? Then if it does not, then there is no point in going forward on that particular path. You either find an alternative path or shelve the idea. So that's your second reason. Reason number 3 is you need to test your idea against the market. You need to understand what the market wants. Let's say your product functions beautifully, it functions as intended, but is there a significant market for your product? Do people actually want to pay money to buy your product? Now, in that case, if there's no significant market for your product, then there's no point in going forward. However, if there is a significant market, then it makes the progress worthy of your time, effort, and resources. Therefore, you can use the MVP. So MVP is the short for minimum viable product. I'll be using MVP throughout the evening, just to let you know. So you can use the MVP to garner feedback from the market, and it is an accepted industry form. So that's reason number 3 why you may want to engage in minimum viable product. The fourth one is a no strings offering, which is basically a bare minimum product with basic functionality to generate some initial revenue. Or, for example, budget airlines with cheap tickets, narrow seats, and added extras for priority boarding, check-in luggage, on-board food and drink, etc. are a very good example of another minimum viable product. The other example is all of us are familiar to the automobile. We all drive cars. When you look at any car company, they have variants on the models. They have an entry-level model, they have an advanced model, they have a super luxury model, and so forth. So the entry-level model is another good example of a minimum viable product. So reason number 3 is giving people reason number 4 is giving people a no strings offering. And finally, to get more funding and investment, because when you're looking to apply for investment, whether it is through investors, private equity, or for grants with some of the funding agencies, having an MVP is likely to increase your chance of success when you're trying to apply for funding, because it builds confidence in your venture so that people know they have a greater chance of return on investment. So that's 5 reasons why you may want to look at an MVP. Now, so what exactly is an MVP? So as the name suggests, it has three parts to it: minimum, viable, and product. Now, let's look at the first bit about the minimum. We'll look at the viable and the product later. First, let's look at the minimum. But the point is, as a collective, they represent at the very least a few minimum criteria this product must fulfill. Firstly, what does minimum mean? Technically possible and functionally able. Now, what do I mean by that? What I'm about to show you next is something some of you may have seen when I did my innovation talk earlier this year. So the question, the all familiar question is, how do we make infinite energy? Firstly, you know that cats always land on their feet. You also know that the bread with butter always falls buttered side down. What do you do next? You fasten the bread with the butter to the cat's back, and then you have this cat bread mechanism that keeps rotating and will never fall to the ground. Then you attach the cat bread to the generator, and then what do you get? Infinite energy. Now, as much as imaginative this is, we know that this is not technically possible and this is not functionally able. So, when we talk about technically possible, it has to be possible within the realms of our technical, engineering, and scientific knowledge. When we talk about functionally able, the product should actually work. We'll come to that later. The next thing, regulatory and legal requirements. Now, what do I mean by regulatory and what do I mean by legal? There is a distinctive difference between these. Regulatory defines the sector-specific rules, which is your standards and codes, and the legal defines the law of the land. What do I mean by this? For example, if you want to develop a medical device, you must meet the regulatory compliance required of the appropriate standards, such as 13485 and what have you. And at the same time, you must meet the law of the land where you want to deploy the medical device. So regulatory refers to the industry and sector, and legal is law of the land. Now, then the other thing you need to look at now is when we talk about viable. So for a product to be viable, you need three things. The first thing is what we call effectiveness. That is, does the product do what it says it will? If I give you an everyday example, take the painkiller Nurofen. Now, effectiveness of the painkiller or the pill is determined by whether or not it provides relief against pain. If it doesn't, then it's not fulfilling its function, which is it's not being effective. The next thing we talk about is called consistency. Now, consistency means, does your Nurofen relieve your pain every time you take a pill? If it only relieves pain 4 times out of 10, it is not consistent. So that brings us to the question of, is it trustworthy? Is it reliable? So effectiveness and consistency together combine and offer us assurance in the product or a solution. Now, if your product or a solution does not fulfill these criteria, then there is no point in talking about the next thing. And furthermore, it is not a product or a solution. However, for all intents and purposes, today we will assume your product idea or your product idea is effective and you know it will be consistent. The final thing we talk about is efficiency. So when we talk about efficiency, what do we say? We talk about whether it presents value for resources spent. When I say resources in this instance, I'm not talking just about money, but I'm also talking about things like the time, the effort, the skills, and the ease of usage for your end users, and so on and so forth. So the viable bit of the minimum viable product needs to focus on effectiveness, consistency, and efficiency. And finally, the final word is the product. Now, interestingly enough, a product is necessarily not a product, but it is the opportunity to offer a solution. And when I talk about products, it covers a wide spectrum. It's like things like products that we can touch, feel, see, and use. This also includes experiences such as traveling, queuing up, holidays, cinemas, and so on and so forth, and even services such as broadband, mobile internet connection, and TV streaming, and so on and so forth. Now, for example, airlines offer a service of letting people travel on different classes of seats, and they call them an economy class product. What they're offering you is a service dressed as a product. The other thing that works as a product as well is a process. Now, a process is what we adapt, or the process is how we make things. Everything that we do is driven by a process. So specifically, when we talk about our manufacturing industry and so on and so forth, we talk about design of systems, design of manufacturing processes, user experience processes and interfaces and so forth, they also can be classified as products. Now, the main thing we need to remember here is your minimum viable product, or your MVP, offers a solution that is unique at the time and the place of introduction into the market. It is a unique solution at the point when it is introduced into the market and at the time when it is introduced into the market. Now, having come this far, let's look at a few common misconceptions. Right? The first one is basically what David spoke about, whereas we do not have enough money to make a full product, so let's make a minimum viable product. Now, the misconception here is that the focus on being a minimum viable product, they end up missing out on the viable bit. So what happens is they focus on the minimum and they focus on whatever the product is, and they forget the viable bit. And if you saw earlier in my slide, the viable bit is where the core or the heart of your product is. Because if it's not effective, if it's not consistent, there's no question of efficiency, and you actually don't have a product. So your product must fulfill all its basic functional, technical, legal, and regulatory requirements in order to be called a minimum viable product. Therefore, that's the first misconception. The second one is this image that you probably are all familiar. If you Google up MVP or minimum viable product, this image crops up almost 99% out of 100. Now, the problem here is, this is what people say you develop a minimum viable product. The problem here is, if you look at it, the image 1 is a skateboard. The image 2 is a scooter. The third one is a bicycle. The fourth one is a motorbike. And the fifth one is a car. There are 5 different products. It's not one product, it's 5 different products. So that's not how you do minimum viable products. Now, keeping this in mind, let's look at how exactly a minimum viable product must be. I keep going back to this whole thing about airlines because for me that presents a very simple and easy to explain example. When we talk about airline seats, you have economy, you have premium economy, you have business class and first class, and some of them even have what is called as residences on their services. So if you take the standard economy class seat of any airline, no matter how budget it is, it fulfills all the mandatory regulatory and legal requirements of what an airline seat must do. And it also fulfills the requirements, albeit very basic, of seating a passenger for the duration of a flight in a safe manner. And building on this minimum viable product are the other products like your premium economies and the business classes and the first classes are built. So if you want to think about a minimum viable product, go straight to the economy seat in any airline or the entry-level variant of any car. So that's a minimum viable product. Now, the other misconception people have is they think they have arrived. That's a big thing. People think that once you develop a minimum viable product, you've arrived. Your company is there. You're done. You've achieved what you need to achieve. The problem is you've only arrived at the starting line. Now, a minimum viable product or a product journey is not like a drag race, or it's not like an F1 race of 50, 60 laps. It's a bit like a 24 hours of the Le Mans. You have changing conditions all the time. The market dynamics are changing. The customer needs are changing. The way we do things are changing. Therefore, with the minimum viable product, that is purely the starting point for you to go forward and deliver more and more to meet the demands of the market and the customers. Now that we've looked at what the common misconceptions are, so how do we start? What is the first step in going forward on a minimum viable MVP journey? The first thing you need to do is start with the problem. What you need to do is you need a clear definition of the problem you're trying to solve and why it presents a problem. Ideally, you should be able to define this in one sentence. For example, the current levels of unmanned maintenance machine downtime presents a problem because we're not able to manufacture enough parts to meet our customer demands, which if continued will mean we'll lose customers. So the clear definition of the problem is that there is a lot of unplanned machine downtime. And why it is a problem? If it continues, we cannot meet customer order demands and therefore we'll meet customers. That's a very clear definition of a clear problem statement. Once you've done that, the next step is to define what your solution is. I'm not talking about the product, I'm talking about the solution, because a product is a means to solve the problem. So the proposal, what you need to do is exactly the way you defined a problem, you will need to define a solution. How will it look like? For the problem I spoke about earlier about the unplanned machine downtime, the proposed solution will alert operators as to when the machine is likely to break down with sufficient time to replace the faulty parts, and this will help in eliminate unplanned downtimes and therefore help us get better control over production schedules. So that presents your solution, clear definition of solution. So you have defined a problem, you have defined a solution. Now we need to do one more thing as your starting step. The next thing you will need to do is basically define what success and failure will be, and define how you measure success or failure. Now, you will define what outcomes will determine whether the solution is a success or a failure. For example, for this hypothetical scenario, let's say the success in this case will be if we reduce unplanned downtime by 20% across all machines this quarter, and we measure this downtime based on the data we gather from the shop floor. So you have a clear definition of what a success or failure will be and how you can measure it. Now, so that's how you get started towards developing an MVP. Now, in order to do that, you have the basic ingredients you have the basic steps to get started. Now what you need is some essential ingredients. So let's look at them now. So the first set of ingredients, there's about 5 of them. I'll tell you what it is. The first one is investment and budget. How much money do you want to put into this? You need a clear idea of how much you're willing to invest in terms of money. The next thing you need is time. You need to have a realistic estimation of the time by which you plan to launch your MVP. The third one you need, of course, is team. You need a bunch of people, which is the necessary knowledge, skills, and capabilities. And at this point, you can also look at see where there are any knowledge gaps or skill gaps within the organization and see whether you need to venture out to bring these skills in. The next thing is you need supply chain and logistics. This is a twofold thing. You need a robust supply chain to supply you with all the necessary materials you need for your product. And you also need a robust outbound logistics to ensure that your MVP reaches your market. That's the next ingredient you need. And then finally, if you do intend to manufacture prototypes, you need to have a robust manufacturing facility, or you need to have capabilities in-house, or you go and get it done. So this set of ingredients is my first set, and we call this resources, which is money, time, people, supply chain and logistics, and manufacturing infrastructure. The next set of ingredients, which is number 2, is supporting infrastructure. What do I mean by this? This represents all the resources, everything you need to design and deliver the minimum viable product or the MVP. This deals with everything that your end users will need in order to successfully utilize your product. For example, if you are developing a product for, let's say, one of the developing countries where electricity reliability can be a problem, you need to think that if there is likely to be an electricity supply problem, how do we overcome this? The next thing is, if you are thinking about a product that will need broadband or internet connectivity, you need to ask yourself, is that mandatory? For example, most of you must be familiar with the fitness brand called Peloton, Peloton. If you notice their adverts on TV, it explicitly mentions that in order to use their Peloton products, you must have an internet connection. So that's a support infrastructure. The next thing is, you need to determine whether the people who are going to be using your products have the right level of knowledge on how your product works, or do they know how to use the product. So creating an essential knowledge around your product is also part of your support infrastructure. And finally, I had to bring this up here because all of us today are talking about electric cars. Everywhere you go, electric cars are going to be the future, e-mobility, and so on and so forth. Now, the question we need to ask, if we need to make sure that the world, all the people in the world start using electric cars, we need to ask ourselves, do we have enough charging stations to match the quantity and the speed of our petrol stations to make them truly effective? So these set of things together is called as the support infrastructure. So the 3 essential ingredients you need are resources, a support infrastructure, and then the most important thing, a target market. That's the next thing we're going to talk about. Now, more often than not, your target market is absolutely essential even for an MVP. Now, for any product or a service across any sector, the target audience or the target market is spread across a spectrum. Now, on the one hand, you have novices. An example of a novice, especially with technology or tech, is someone like my dad, who's had an incredibly successful career in his life over a period of years, but he abhors the idea of using a simple piece of app called WhatsApp to be in touch with me and my wife and all of that. So, or for the matter, a touchscreen phone. That is the novices on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum are what I call as the expert users, which is basically my teenage nephews and nieces who lap up technology like fish to water. And if you look at the two extreme ends of your market spectrum, the rest of your users are fall well within this broad spectrum. Now, the question you need to ask yourself at this stage is, how do we balance the needs of the novices who like familiarity with the needs of the experts who are looking for novelty all the time? So balancing familiarity with novelty is a tricky challenge, which is what you will need to focus on when you talk about the market. When you get some time, I would definitely recommend going to YouTube and look up Steve Jobs' iPhone launch video in 2007 when the first iPhone came. They were introducing a novel product at the time, which nobody had seen, a touchscreen smartphone. But what Steve Jobs did beautifully in the talk is, before he introduced the phone, he kept telling people, an iPod, a phone, an internet communication device, an iPod, a phone, an iPod, a phone. So he was familiarizing people because people knew iPods, people knew phones, and then he says an iPhone. So he balanced familiarity with novelty before introducing the iPhone. That's the kind of thing you need to think about how we develop an MVP in terms of a market. So your three essential ingredients are resources, support infrastructure, and most importantly, the market. Now, the other thing we need to remember is the world is changing incredibly with everything that's going on around us. And therefore, there are 5 factors that I believe we all need to consider when we start developing minimum viable products. The first of those factors is what I call personalization. What I mean by personalization is, let's be honest about it. We're all surrounded by social media. We've got the LinkedIns, the Twitters, the Instagrams, and I don't know what new application will turn up by the time we finish today's session. Now, what happens with this is a lot of this social media means that there is an inherent pressure on all of us, especially the target market, is to be accepted, to be a part of a cult, and this stems from the desire for all of us to find common ground amongst our peers and the society around us. Now, as a paradox, we also have the pressure or the urge to express our individuality. We need to fit in, but we also need to stand out because we're all individual people with our own personalities, our tastes, choices, and desires and wants. And we often reflect our personality in the kind of things that we own. We no longer crave for the latest smartphone. We want something exclusive and so on and so forth. Now, this brings with it challenges of how do you build the need for personalization and individualization into your product itself. I'm not saying you need to bring all those things, but you will need to make room to bring these factors into consideration when you develop your MVP. Now, the next thing we need to talk about, which is very important, is care for the planet. We're moving towards a more sustainable future. We're talking about clean energy, green energy. We're talking about better recycling, waste management, eliminating single-use plastics and all that. There has never been a more urgent requirement to care for the planet and tell the world we are doing so. Now, sadly, the one thing is sustainability and environmentalism are seen more as an activism rather than an actual activity. So what we need to do is encourage large-scale participation of people in sustainable practices, right? So what we need to do in that case is we need to start talking about how can we make our products sustainable. The old cycle is design, manufacture, use, and decommission or throw away. What we need to think is design, manufacture, use, and recommission or repurpose. And the other advantage is with the cost of internet going down, the number of subscribers is going up, which means information is available across the world, and people will quickly know what is sustainable, what is not sustainable, and we need to be agile in order to be able to meet these demands from our sustainably conscious people. The next thing I'm going to talk about today in terms of the factors that influence product development is called inclusivity. Every meeting we go, every boardroom, every forum, there is always a talk about diversity and inclusion and inclusivity and all that. Now they talk about workplace, careers, opportunities, and so on and so forth. But what we are talking about today is a different kind of inclusivity. Let me explain that with a few examples. Example one is population in the world that drives on the left-hand side of the word, such as ourselves in the UK, the other Commonwealth countries like India, Australia, New Zealand. Now, we all know that 65% of the world drives on the wrong side of the road, as I like to call it. Now, that is two-thirds of the world. Now, if automotive companies catered only to 65% of the population and ignored all of us who drive on the left side of the road, then there would be no options for us. But the car companies realize that catering to this 35% also helps them in their bottom line. Therefore, they cater to the minority, which is the 35% of the world, which drives on the left side of the road. The second thing is people who are left-handed. As an individual, I write with my right hand, but there are so many other things I do with my left hand. I mean, operating machinery or playing snooker or whatever it is. Now, when I try to use a pair of scissors, I really struggle to find a pair of scissors that cater to left-handers. So what I'm trying to say is the only 10% of the population is left-handed, but 90% of the population is right-handed. But 10% of 7 billion is still what? 700 million people? So by not catering to the minority of left-handed users, you're missing out on catering to the aspirations of 700 million people. That's a huge number. That's almost 10 times the population of the UK. Now, the next thing we need to talk about when we talk about inclusivity is culturally appropriate characteristics. What may be appropriate in one culture may not be appropriate in another culture. So therefore, we need to become more culturally sensitive to what is okay and what is not okay, and how different things affect the sensitivities of different cultures and people. And finally, we talk about people with special requirements and special needs. Most of us get by with what is available on the market. However, some of us require special features. You find tall people, short people, young people, old people, people with smaller hands, bigger hands, and people with certain health condition disabilities, which come with special requirements. The point I'm trying to make is none of these conditions should make anybody feel left out. Therefore, it is important for us to design products for people with these needs, and it is also equally important to preserve a sense of subtlety to hide the fact that it's designed specifically for certain kind of people. So that's what inclusivity is that I'm talking about, 4 different things. Now, finally, there is one more thing, which is the perceptions of success around the world. What I'm trying to say here is there are perceptions of success. Success today for people doesn't simply mean getting a university education or a high-paying job or whatever it is, or a good academic record or so on and so forth. It could be achievement and contentment with life choices and so on and so forth. So we need to be very careful with our products as to they do not give people a wrong perception of success. And then there's the other thing about perceptions of market. For example, let's say if we go back 20, 30 years ago, some countries would be considered a market which are low-cost markets, and therefore the products that would go there wouldn't be of a similar kind of quality as you would get in the UK. If I give an example, we did not have airbags in Indian cars until about 10, 11 years ago, because that was not considered a mandatory requirement. So that drove costs. And therefore, things like that, we need to be very careful, because perceptions of the market are changing, and we need to have our finger on the pulse to ensure that we cater to the various markets and change our perceptions. And finally, when we talk about the final ingredient or the final factor that's influencing the way we develop products, is the thing about ethical consideration towards society and communities, and compassion. Now, there is no doubt that companies are there to make a profit. That's part of what they do. However, the way they make their money is also quite important. Ethics and ethical practices are more about going above and beyond the minimum requirements one must meet to stay within regulatory frameworks. What I mean by this is the rail industry, for example, has a number of quality requirements and standards that the train operators must meet. However, despite all these quality requirements, what we see as customers, especially in the northern part of our country with the train operators, is the customer experience and the standards of service have been deteriorating thanks to delays, cancellations, increasing fares, and potentially crumbling infrastructure. Whilst the legal and regulatory requirements are being met, the ethics of doing business, especially in a customer-faced environment, aren't really being met. That's what we talk about ethics. When we talk about society, I'm talking more than the people and the social structures. I'm talking about the ecosystem that a company is depend on in order to deliver its products and services. For example, how many employees are you employing locally within I don't know, an X radius of your company? For example, Airbus in the UK has about 13,000 direct employees and over 100,000 strong workforce that forms part of its supply chain, which ranges from plants like Rolls-Royce to many SME companies, a total of 2,500 and plus companies. That's catering to the community's needs and society's needs by employing locally, buying locally, and so on and so forth. And finally, what makes us who we are as people is compassion. Compassion is not an effect, but it is the cause of the good ethical practices and the care for society. Now, having compassion as an organization is what drives our care for society and drives our ethical practices. And that can be reflected in the company's values. For example, there is a company that was founded in 1886, a healthcare company called Johnson & Johnson, or a pharmaceutical company. That company has been in business for around 130 years. And that is an incredibly long time for any company in this day and age. And one of the reasons for their longevity is their compassion, which is reflected in their credo, which is available on their website. I would definitely suggest for people to have a read through it. Having spoken about all of this, one thing that I must mention is doing MVPs also has a number of risks associated with it. What I will do is I will show you three major risks that are associated with MVPs. The first one is the risk of over-delivering. What do I mean by over-delivering is you need to make a minimum viable product, but what people do is they just make a minimum product which is not viable, or on the other hand, they make a product that is feature-ridden, and then what happens is people may just not like it. The thing to remember in this case, to avoid over-delivering on your MVP, is remember M stands for minimum. That's the key to remember here. The next thing, why people want to embark on an MVP is because they do it for the wrong reasons. They say everyone is doing it, so we must do it. You don't have to do it because everyone is doing it. As we spoke about earlier in your starting phase, we must clearly define what the problem is, what the solution is that we are offering, and what is the parameters by which we measure success or failure, and how do we measure it. Only if you have a clear definition to a problem and a solution, only then will you go ahead on your MVP journey. And final thing is, this is something I spoke about in my last lecture as well, is aversion to failure. The point to remember is, this is important. When you are developing an MVP, you don't have a failure. It is a learning experience. It's one of two things. It's either the MVP is well accepted by your target market of initial users, which gives you enough assurance to go ahead and make a full product or a large scale product. On the other hand, what happens is, if the market isn't accepting it, you will get valuable feedback and experience and learning from the market, which will help you tailor or alter your approach and try something different to do an MVP. Now, obviously, we need to talk about benefits. I told you why you must do an MVP, but there are certain very clear benefits. The first thing is you have a fairly quick and cost-effective validation of the idea and the product. Now, the next thing, what you get is you get confidence and assurance, or learning and discovery. What this means is your MVP has good initial traction, which gives you the confidence in moving forward with full-scale development of the product. Your investors or your funders potentially also have the confidence that they can fund your project or your product going forward, and so forth. And then finally, the most important thing you will get out of this is getting a proper understanding of what your users need and what they want. And that kind of insight is invaluable. No amount of money can give you that kind of insight that an MVP will give you. Even if the product fails and customers don't accept it, you will get feedback from them as to what they want. Now, that kind of brings me to most of this talk. What I did tell you earlier is I'm going to leave you with a set of toolkits. So I'm going to show you three different toolkits, and none of these are engineering toolkits. These are more about understanding how to go about doing the MVP from the customer's point of view as well, predominantly. So the first one is what I call as an MVP delivery statement that you need to make, which is just an extension of what I spoke about in your first step. Define problem in one sentence. You define the solution in one sentence. You define your success and failures parameters, and you define how you measure this. That's your first toolkit. You can take an Excel spreadsheet or a Word document, take this thing and start typing away and see what you come up with. The next toolkit, what I call, is as-is and to-be analysis. Now, the as-is bit refers the current situation, and the second bit, which is to-be, refers the required or the desired situation. And the best way to do it is do it visually with the example of drawing figures or flow charts or whatever it is. And then when you lay these two as-is and to-be situations one next to the other, then that will give you a clear idea of what are the steps you need to take to get from as-is to to-be. So that's your as-is and to-be analysis. And finally, this is also an extension of what I spoke about earlier, which is your three ingredients, which is, market, capabilities, and infrastructure. So market, identify the users you want to target in the spectrum of users we identified earlier. More often than not, you will be targeting a selection of novices and a selection of expert users to get their feedback. And if you can satisfy these groups, everyone else is within the spectrum. The next thing is you need to do an honest analysis of the support infrastructure that's available for your product to function, for the people to use your product effectively. Again, this is an extension of what I spoke about earlier. And finally, capability. Do you have all the resources you have to develop your product in-house? Do you have any gaps that you will need to fill? And what does the supply chain look like? What does the logistics look like? And so on and so forth. So these are your three MVP toolkits that I'm going to leave you with. Now, finally, what we have now is the summary of what we spoke about. So what is an MVP? It's a solution that fulfills all the technical and functional requirements with effectiveness, consistency, and efficiency. There are three common misconceptions which we've been through. I've told you where to start. You define your problem, solution, success, or failure, your essential ingredients that form part of your toolkit, market, resources, and the infrastructure. There are 5 factors we spoke about, things like personalization, sustainability, inclusivity, global perceptions, and ethics, compassion, and society. And finally, we've seen the benefits of developing MVPs. When I say benefits, this is what you will get at the very least. This is the minimum benefits you will get when you develop an MVP. And finally, we have the 3 MVP toolkits. That kind of brings to the end of my actual talk, and I would normally take you all to the Q&A session. But at this point in time, I would like to make an appeal to the good people of the IMechE, to the membership and to the fellowship. As most of you or all of you are aware, India at the moment is undergoing a COVID-19 crisis. Currently, the British Asian Trust, the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, and the Thai UK North are coordinating efforts and raising money to help with the situation. And now there is a requirement to procure the following equipment from the UK and ship it across to India. This is not an appeal for charity. This is an appeal for engineering and manufacturing companies who have the capability to provide this equipment: empty refillable oxygen cylinders, oxygen concentrators, ventilators, and in situ oxygen manufacturing plants. If you work with companies or if you know of companies who can manufacture these and they have in stock, please get in touch with me and we can talk about the terms and engagement and everything to see how we can make this happen. This is just an appeal I had because of the situation that's going on, and I have a personal interest in this because all of my family, including my parents, still live in India, so this is highly personal to me as well. Now, thank you for listening to me for that last 1 minute. Now, as promised, let's go to the Q&A.
Thank you, Ram. I hope I'm back off mute. I should be able to hear me okay. Right, so first question. Hello?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me okay, yeah? Yeah, it's lovely, Thank you. So the first question I've got, Ram, is you talked about the development of MVPs, obviously. Is the development of an MVP a one-off exercise, or can you go through various different iterations? That's the question we've been posed tonight.
It's definitely not a one-off. I mean, the way you look at it is, if your MVP hits initial traction from your target market at the very first go, then you continue developing that as a product. But if you're developing a specific MVP which has hit some roadblocks from the market, you use the feedback that you get from the market and try a different approach. So you can do it, and you can develop multiple MVPs to do different things. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I think it does, yep. I hope it answers the question. Another question I've got here is, for most companies, the budget seems to be a big thing. Obviously, getting the money up front. You mentioned before about money being one of the first things you should think about. the question is, for most companies, budgets seem to be the biggest thing that holds them back. Is there a way that you can advise a way of overcoming this?
Okay, what I'm going to say now is you probably cannot overcome this, but what you can probably do is, let's say if you're already entered a financial year, or if you're measuring your financial performance in quarterly basis, let me just make sure I'm unmuted. No, I'm fine. Looks like, can you all hear me,
Yeah,
David?
I can hear you. Yes,
So
I can hear
what
you.
I'm saying is, yeah. So what happens is, so if you're looking at how you can overcome this budgetary constraint, an easier way to do this perhaps will be, let's say you allocate an X percentage of your company's revenue or your company's profit exclusively for developing MVPs and for driving innovation. That way, if you get commitment from the leadership and the creativity and the ingenuity from the engineering teams and product development teams, that is a good way to go forward. And if you can allocate an X percentage of your budget or your revenue or profits, you can go for it and develop your MVP. Does it answer the question?
Okay, I believe it does. Yes. We got one last question that I've been given here, which is you talked in your presentation about customization. What do you mean by that? And can you give us some examples of it?
Yeah, I can give you a few examples. I'm going to start with the all familiar example of the kebab shop that most of us are aware of. Well, if you go to a kebab shop, whenever at the end of a long night or whenever you want to, you have a certain variance. You have, I don't know, you have a chicken kebab, you have a lamb, or you have a doner or whatever. So that's the basic product, which basically does what it says. It's a bit of grilled meat, and then the customization comes in whether you want it with a pita bread or a naan bread or a chili sauce or the garlic sauce or whatever it is. But the basic thing that is there, which functions, is the kebab, and then you have all these additional extras. Similarly, if you talk about, let's say, buying a car, all the car companies today have car customization on their website, where you can pick and choose what you want to have in your car. What they do have is a fixed range of engines, transmissions, and all of that. But what you get is the ability to customize whether you want additional driving aids, whether you want leather seats, whether you want cloth seats, and so on and so forth. So that's customization when you buy your car, while without compromising the basic functional requirements of the car.
Okay, thank you very much. I actually got one more question just come through. Great, excellent. When developing an MPV, you talk about resources. For the team developing the MVP, should this be a small dedicated team with the right skills, or coming broadly from the organisation? So you need a small dedicated team, or pull in from the bigger business.
So the way I would do it is, obviously, the technical knowledge and resources that are needed to actually work on the project is obviously a core dedicated team of people. However, if you want to understand whether or not the product is actually going to work in a target market, you also need to have a bunch of people who do not understand the technical nitty-gritties of developing a product. A familiar example we used to use when we used to run innovation workshops is you need a representative from every department of the company, and you need a 5-year-old, because a 5-year-old will ask you questions which most of you who are in the box will not ask, because the 5-year-old doesn't know what's going on. So you need somebody who isn't familiar with what's going on within your core dedicated skilled team to ask those questions that will make you think differently. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, yeah, I think that probably answers the question. So yeah. So you can have a dedicated team, but you need some interlopers in there who are going to ask the why, what, and when questions.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, I actually don't have any more questions, Ram. So unless you've got anything more, one just great. There you go. So you say you got no more questions, and one flies into the letterbox. Right. It was a long-winded one. Right, bear with me. So. This gentleman's got a situation where one company originated an idea for an MVP, but the first customer who is funding this development insists on owning the IP. Oh, right, okay. Can you suggest a solution where the originator of the idea, who is carrying out the development, can market the product after initial development, and both the originator and funder of the development can both achieve their initial individual objectives?
Okay, that's just a bit of a trick question. Looks like that's a googly there, Ben, but let me try and see how I can answer this to my ability. So the problem here is not one of a technical one, but it's more of a legal one. Now, what I would do if somebody has got an idea, where one company has got the idea for the MVP, now, before you even go to a customer or a funder, what you must be doing before you reveal the idea is protecting your intellectual property. Whether you file for a patent in the name of the originator or the originating company, or you do what is called as a design registration with the IP office before you even go to the funding people. So the basic thing you will be doing is making sure you protect your IP. That way, if the customer says they want to own the IP, then you can say, look, it's not possible because we've already registered the patent in our name. So, that's one way to move forward. But if you want a compromise, you can give them exclusivity to your product as the first customer. Maybe that's something to look at.
Interesting. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Ben. There's another long-winded one here. I think one of the key things to remember with delivering an MVP is being willing to fail. You've mentioned that, yeah. You don't fail. You just trial and error. But understand that if you fail, you learn. Yeah, exactly. So it's better to fail in the early stages of as early as possible. It can be difficult to overcome the fear of failure culture, particularly in industries that are process safety driven, like the nuclear industry, chemical industries, places like that, where failure is not seen as a good thing, where employees and team members are naturally cautious and want to build in many safety factors. Do you have any specific tips to overcome this cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean,
I can
the one
relate to
thing
that.
no, absolutely. That's a very valid question. And having worked in the nuclear sector myself, I completely understand where Matthew is coming from. The main thing about this fear of failure is the way to overcome this cultural shift is, like I said earlier, we talk about defining clearly the problem, defining clearly the solution, and defining what the success and failure mechanisms will be. It is important to set expectations at the very off and let people know that, look, we're embarking on something new, which is a novel thing for us. There is a high possibility that the intended consequence, the intended success may not happen, but because it's an MVP, we are going to get feedback from the market, and we're going to use that to try and change the way we do things. Believe me, changing the culture is not the easiest of things. It is the most important thing because we as people love our comfort zones. We love staying in our bubble, which is why you see still companies using Windows XP and Windows NT because it's a culture of being in a comfort zone. It is not an easy thing to do, but by setting expectations right at the very beginning, you at least can, let's say, minimize the impact of the blow rather than, and it has to happen. And go for small wins. When people see small wins happening, you get the buy-in from the people. So the thing to do is not go for a BHAG or a big hairy audacious goal, but go for something smaller. Start with something that will get you easy wins, get the buy-in from the people, and once people are confident, then start embarking on bigger projects.
Okay, thank you. There's a few people asked about whether the presentation will be made available. I should have said at the start, this presentation actually been recorded. It will be made available to all tonight's delegates. We'll be sending it out to you directly, but it will ultimately be available through the IMechE YouTube page as well, so you can be able to revisit this presentation at your leisure. That answers a couple of questions that's come in of late. And that was me filling in time to see if anybody else would ask any more questions. And it looks like we've come to the end of the questions, Ram. So from my point of view, I'd like to thank you very much. And yet another fascinating talk. And rest assured, it won't be the last you'll do for us. I can guarantee that. There's many more opportunities, I know, for you to come back and give us another scintillating presentation. So thank you from the IMechE West Cumbria's point of view. Thank you for everybody who's attended this evening and witnessed the talk. We will have some more virtual presentations in the coming month from the West Cumbria area. I think we've got one in May and we've also got one lined up for June. And that will be coming out through our local network and also the IMechE network very soon. So with that, I'll bring the presentation to a close. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, David. Thank you all.